Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, an engineer with a deep passion for sustainable aviation and AI. Today's discussion centers on a commercial strategy for managing contrails. Previous guests have highlighted that persistent contrails, the clouds formed by aircraft, account for 1 to 2% of the global climate impact. Joining us today is Dr. Adam Durant. Adam is the founder of SATAVIA, a company at the forefront of developing software solutions to predict, avoid, and confirm aircraft contrails. Adam, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Very nice to have you. And I'd like to start off with a little bit of a personal question. And that is, before you went on the startup journey, you worked as a researcher and you published more than 30 papers during that career. What experiences during this academic career were the trigger points for you to then become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, very, very interesting sort of set of events. Well, I guess going back to the late 1990s when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Bristol University, I ended up getting really interested in volcanoes and how the volcanoes interact with the atmosphere. So volcanic emissions, volcanic ash. And that actually led me to do a PhD at Michigan Tech under Professor Bill Rose. And Bill had a habit of really being able to connect together different disciplines. So he built this collaboration with atmospheric physicists, Raymond Shaw, Will Contrail. They're world experts in cloud microphysics and turbulence. And so I went on to do a PhD on how volcanic ash is removed from the atmosphere. A lot of that is driven by cloud microphysical processes, so water forming on the ash particles. But sort of fast forwarding to the late 2000s, I kind of finished that PhD, thought I was in a fairly niche subject, came back to the UK on a Aviation fellowship and started working with some of the climate science teams at Bristol University at the time who were getting Nobel Peace Prizes. So I already ended up in these groups doing climate science. And I ended up actually moving to Cambridge, working on the carbon cycle, so measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it was 2 weeks into that contract that there was this volcano that erupted in Iceland, 𝐸𝐤𝐤𝐿. And all of a sudden, all that sort of academic preparation that I'd done around volcanic clouds, remote sensing of volcanic clouds, cloud microphysics, it all came into use. So ultimately, I ended up beginning my journey into entrepreneurship by moving to Norway and working for a spin-out company of the Norwegian Institute for Air Research. And we took Earth-observing satellite technology, so thermo-infrared technologies that enabled the detection of volcanic ash clouds. So we put that on the wing of an aircraft, worked with Airbus and EasyJet at the time, doing flight test, developing a system that could ultimately end up on the flight deck to enable pilots to discriminate between ash and water clouds and do deviations. So in a lot of respects, it's a lot like the same kind of challenges faced today with contrails and how to avoid that impact. So yeah, a bit of serendipity. I could never have planned 20 years ago, I'm going to go and study volcanic clouds and cloud microphysics because I know in 20 years' time, I'm going to be trying to help to prevent some of the climate impact from aviation. But it was those set of events that ultimately led me to then found SATAVIA about a decade ago to bring some of the best available science to the aviation industry, solving problems in predictive maintenance. But more recently, we moved into helping to solve the problem of aviation's impact on climate.
Now, we have the unique opportunity to get what's called an elevator pitch, or maybe a very sharp discussion, because you bring this entrepreneurial perspective here. How would you describe what contrails are, how they harm the climate, and what your approach is in an elevator pitch?
Well, I guess I'll start with what we're trying to do. So SATAVIA is reducing the climate impact of flying by mitigating the warming effect from the clouds produced by aircraft, enabling airlines to claim carbon credits. So in a single statement, that's what we're trying to do. So globally, aircraft contrails, which are the white streaky clouds produced by aircraft, these trap heat in the atmosphere And it's known that this can increase aviation's climate impact, possibly by as much as over 30%. And that's contributing to global warming. It's worth noting that only 5% of all flights create about 80% of that warming. So actually, if you think about solutions, that makes it quite attainable. We've just got to solve the warming effect from about 5% of all flights to solve the majority of the problem. Importantly, from 2025, the European Union emission trading scheme is going to start to recognize this impact. So that's really creating the need for airlines to do something about it. So we've developed technology. It's based on numerical weather prediction modeling, and we provide atmospheric intelligence to enable airlines to change their flight plans to avoid this warming impact. And then we go, after the flights have taken place, we verify any changes we've made to flights, and we can calculate the mitigated impact. And we're working alongside Gold Standard, which is a major carbon accreditation platform, to develop a method to then offer an incentive back to the aircraft operators who do this.
Before we go more into details about the trials and also Gold Standard, I have to ask a question about the term startup here. And that is, how do you trade off the communication of having high potential for a high market on one side, while not trying to set the wrong expectations on the other side, for example, for a fast growth?
So SATAVIA is, you may say, still a startup. And I think being a startup reflects that you've identified a problem, you either have a solution or you're creating a solution, and you're taking it to market. And you're still at the early stages of doing that. And early meaning, in the purest sense, I guess, building initial revenue and commercial traction around the solution that you're developing. Once you've gone past a certain phase, you might say you're in a growth phase, which is more about scaling the solution once you've validated that there's product market fit. So we're very much, and then of course, aviation, as you've mentioned, is quite a slow process to move things along. So you may expect that companies spend longer in the earlier stages trying to find that product market fit. So I consciously set up a for-profit company because aviation is for profit. And I also have dedicated a large part of my academic career to climate science or atmospheric science. And so my personal motivations have always been, first of all, to try and understand climate impact better, but actually then to try and do something about it. And the world that we live in is driven by global economics, the free market. And so people think predominantly about making money. And if something doesn't make money in aviation, then it's very hard to sell it into aviation. If it makes money, but also solves climate impact, then not only have you got something that the industry will want, but then it also delivers the outcome we all want, which is a reduction in the climate impact of flying. Flying is really important for a whole range of reasons, and we need to find ways to reduce the climate impact of flying because we rely on it. So how do I weigh the sort of this conundrum of it's a for-profit, but we're actually trying to do something good? Well, I guess in my experience of interacting with airlines, you quite often get asked, what's the return on investment going to be in the next 12 months for this solution that you're pitching in? And unless you have an answer for that, it's highly unlikely that airlines are going to invest in these unless they're just doing marketing. And so we have seen quite a lot of marketing activities, especially around things like sustainable aviation fuel. Obviously, there's not enough to go around today, but there's been a lot of marketing activity. And I think possibly there's only so much more marketing you can do around flights that fly on sustainable fuel because it's kind of been done now. But yeah, in order to really have something that an airline wants, there's got to be a business case around it. So these are kind of all the things I've factored into making that decision. This needs to be a company that delivers climate impact, but also it needs to resonate, our proposition needs to resonate with every type of CEO in an airline. Some are concerned with sustainability, some are concerned with profitability. If we've got something that resonates with all of them, we can deliver that impact. So that's the kind of reasoning behind deciding on the trajectory we're on.
Let's speak about those trials that you're running with airlines. And I think to make our audience understand how the process goes, maybe you could explain the steps that are needed in order to successfully avoid a persistent warming contrail.
The approach we've taken is, first of all, the core technology is numerical weather prediction modeling. So that's weather forecasting. We use a model that has been developed over maybe 30 years. The last 30 years, it's called the Weather Research and Forecast Model. In our team, we have Dr. Greg Thompson, who has been a contributor to that model for many decades. And in fact, we use his cloud microphysics scheme. What we've actually done is invested into making that scheme and the model work better at doing weather forecasting at altitudes aircraft fly at. So we've effectively customized how you run a weather model. We have worked with both Microsoft and AWS to get these science-based models that are written in codes like Fortran to run in the commercial cloud infrastructure. So we're using high-performance compute and all the other infrastructure you need to run one of these weather models that are typically done on a supercomputer by a research organization. So step one is generating a weather forecast. We've also spent the last 2 years working on scientific validation of that forecast. So we actually now have a manuscript that we're almost ready to submit, which gives the skill of that weather model's forecast. We know how often, for example, when we predict an ISSR, how often we get it right, how often we get it wrong. And that's really important then for deciding, is this technology and approach fit for purpose? And we're convinced it's absolutely fit for purpose. So when we do this with airlines, we generate the weather forecast. We don't reveal the contrail information to them because actually we have this carbon credits methodology. We want to ensure that there's a baseline. We want to understand what would have happened had we not intervened. So the airline goes about creating those original flight plans, performance-based, safety-based, but focused on cost of fuel, cost of overflight, other cost. So they minimize to get from A to B. That becomes the baseline. We also analyze the entire schedule. So we process through a flight schedule for every flight to estimate which of those flights are going to be highly warming. So we create a target list. And on the day, as the airline creates the flight plans on that target list, we analyze those flight plans. So analyzing those flight plans involves receiving a flight plan from an airline. We take out the trajectory, the planned trajectory. We take the weather forecast data along that trajectory and then run another model, 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐿 in this case, which is a contrail climate impact model for an individual flight, to assess what the likely contrail climate impact is going to be for that particular flight. And we can convert it into, we go from a radiative effect into a CO2 equivalent amount. We then give a briefing pack back to a flight dispatcher in the airline, which gives them guidance on how they could modify parts of that flight to put the aircraft in a place where it won't make warming contrails if that is the case. It doesn't require every single waypoint, the trajectory to be modified along every single waypoint, but in most cases it's changing the planned flight level by a few thousand feet, maybe 2,000, max 4,000 feet along a small number of waypoints and creating a new flight plan. That then gets submitted to an ANSP like Eurocontrol. If it's compliant, then that becomes the flight plan that they then will follow, and that's passed on to the pilots. We do quite a lot of briefing along the way with the dispatchers and the pilots, so they all understand the nature of the problem, how we're trying to solve it, and what they individually need to do. So in the case of the pilot, it's please follow the flight plan carefully. That's the first phase. The second phase is after the flight's taken place, we will go back and look at the original flight plan, maybe using hindcast data. This is where we've rerun the model, which is constrained then by observational data. and we look at the flown trajectory and we verify, was there an avoided impact and what was it? And we can convert that into a CO2 equivalent relative to the avoided impact. And that's the process that we basically have automated with software. We can do it at scale. There's plenty of opportunity for further optimizations, but this is, our starting point, and we can go and do flight trials with airlines today. When we first started doing this, we initially did a longer term forecast of a 48-hour forecast with our weather model. And we started analyzing the schedule for the following day early to try and find those flight targets. And what we discovered was that our success rate for getting the right targets wasn't high enough. And so we moved everything onto the same day. So actually we try and do the flight target selection within 4 hours or so of the first departure time. And then we are working in near real time when we do this. So every flight plan is unique. It's created on the day by the airline. As soon as it's available, we can analyze that within minutes and provide back a briefing pack for that unique flight plan. The way that we analyze the schedule will be based on historical choices of where they have flown on particular routes, and that isn't necessarily going to be 100% successful, but it's purely just about identifying which flights are likely to be the most warming, so we can focus effort on those and keep the workload to a minimum on the flight dispatch. But hopefully that makes sense. So we do everything as close to time as departure as possible. We run a 24-hour forecast. All our scientific validation has been done on a 24-hour forecast. And we try and, a lot of stuff happens in the last 1 to 2 hours before a flight departs. There's going to be changes in the aircraft mass, depending on what freight ends up on the aircraft. There might be several versions of a flight plan made based on those changes in weight. It could be, new restrictions appearing for air traffic management. So we really have to be working quite close to the time of departure if we're going to get this right.
We've had flight keys here with Alejandra Martin Frias, and I'm wondering, how does this integrate with flight planning software that is currently being used by flight dispatchers, for example, or even the electronic flight bag in the cockpit? So how do you envision this to move from I don't want to say proof of concept, but from this high-tech approach that you just described, right, into an even more scalable solution?
Yeah, so moving towards scalability is key here, and it absolutely requires collaboration with stakeholders like flight planning software providers, flight keys, others. Lufthansa Systems is another example of a very popular flight planning software solution. To be honest, as long as for our methodology where we're aiming to create this incentive, as long as we have a baseline flight plan and then a flown trajectory, others can create those two flight plans. I guess the key thing would be we would need to provide in the weather data into those existing flight planning solutions. But yeah, we do see that a lot of this could be automated, as flight keys are doing today, in the algorithms that generate those flight plans. And that's absolutely the way forward. I guess doing it this way enables us to understand quite closely the various things that impact on the success of a deviation in terms of, did it avoid the climate impact? And if not, why not? And so there's a lot of reasons why it might not be successful. And quite a lot of those boil down to human factors in the whole process of doing a flight plan and then executing a flight plan. But yeah, so absolutely, scaling this requires integration. I'm very impressed with the progress that the flight keys have made, and I hope we can work together on this in the future.
Something else I picked up in your explanation was essentially that airlines look at this in a 12 months time frame, or looking into ROI with regards to 12 months. And I've wondered, how can you prevent airlines from just trialing this out, how could you actually lock in the customers to then help you scale this solution and scale it to apply the solution to the entire fleet even?
Yeah, I guess there are two high-level approaches. One, you could make a regulation, a requirement for them to do this. Two, you can find a way of incentivizing them to do it. So we focused on the second, which is to create a carbon credits type incentive. So we've been working on this for maybe 3 years even, but certainly with gold standard 2 years. And it's gone through various technical scientific committees. We've had feedback and we've adapted the approach to the feedback. And some of the feedback has been, we don't want to see the carbon market flooded with these kind of credits that might demotivate other decarbonization type activities. We don't want airlines to be creating credits from contrail management and then applying those to their carbon emissions. So we've actually ended up creating a unique category of credit with gold standard specifically for aviation's non-CO2 contrail impact, and it's called a certified mitigation outcome unit. We don't even call it a carbon unit, a carbon credit. It's not an offset. It's an in-sector unit that represents avoided radiative impact. And our intent is to create a market around these credits, which doesn't just involve airlines. It could involve any large corporate or person that has or will have a Scope 3 liability from aviation's non-CO2. So as emission trading schemes sort of start recognizing this additional impact, any organization that uses air transport, it follows, will start seeing this Scope 3 liability coming in. So it could be, fuel producers, aircraft lessors, OEMs, organizations that provide finance to aviation. All of these people will have this additional Scope 3 liability. They have it today. They just may not recognize it. So the starting point is to find, just like with direct air capture, they created a market. It's called Frontier. It's an advanced market commitment. They managed to get some very large corporates like Microsoft, Stripe, to make some early commitments, cash commitments, and they created $1 billion market before the technology was ready, before the credits were there. But it's high integrity credits. It does what it says it does. It removes carbon from the atmosphere. And they created this market to help seed the market and then drive those technologies forward. So I believe we could do something similar with contrails, contrail management, the creation of the market. We're also aiming to work closely with organizations like the International Civil Aviation Organization and 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤 to hopefully find a way to have these credits recognized in some way under 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤. But again, there'll be some unique situations around what category they would sit in, because today we don't have CMOUs recognized by any emission trading scheme. And of course, maybe even the EU ETS, there might be an ultimate way that there could be some credit given based on these units, which go back to direct interventions that were done. But yeah, that's kind of how we see our approach is to try and create this market, find buyers, and then that finance will filter directly back to airlines doing contrail management. The airline itself obviously takes ownership of those credits. We would take a share to cover the cost of delivering that service to the airline. And so that's kind of how we would operate and scale this solution ultimately.
Please help me understand this a little bit better. For someone who has not looked into this for so many years like you deliberately had credits that are not carbon credits, but that are for avoidance. You want to separate them, but then if you want to integrate them, $1 is $1, right? Or €1 is €1.
Well, absolutely. The equivalence is the same in terms of a ton of CO2 equivalent avoided impact. And that's really covered by our methodology of how do we get to that. And that's what's gone through all the review over the past few years. Once we get to that unit, then there's already this system in place for recognizing those units and even doing trading. However, there isn't yet a category for this particular kind of credit. And I believe that's what the EU ETS is working on. How does it measure? How's it going to measure the non-CO2 part? I presume because it's not CO2, it's not necessarily going to be put in the same bucket as CO2. But I guess we're waiting to see what comes out of the project that's running at the moment with the EU ETS, which is actually designing how they're going to do that. But if I was doing it, I would create a unique category in that emission trading scheme for this non-CO2 impact, because it's not the same thing as CO2, and equally it shouldn't be priced the same way. We know the cost of decarbonisation is going to be very high. The cost of doing contrail management might be 100 times less to avoid the same per unit climate impact on a per ton basis. We actually have a paper which is coming out shortly with Roland Berger, where we've actually done some, and the Rocky Mountain Institute, where we've done some calculations on what this might actually cost to do relative to the cost of decarbonisation.
And in the timeline for bringing the gold standard approach to life, where do we stand? When can airlines actually apply this?
Well, we are hoping to hear sort of preliminary outcome of the current review that's underway with independent expert reviewers, possibly as soon as this month or next month. And we hope within up to 3 months, we will have completed the process, putting us in a position where we can actually issue these credits. We have also started exploring already doing forwards agreements. So where we do an offtake, we sell future credits. We have done one transaction with a small startup based in California. But yeah, we're kind of in a position today where we're ready to start creating the market. And of course, this finance is going to feed directly back into actually trying to solve the problem.
I have a lot of respect for this approach, because for me, it seems a little bit like what Tesla did, when everyone was saying there are not enough charging stations, and that's why we can't have electric cars. So they built the charging stations. And essentially, what you're doing is very entrepreneurial and very pioneering by setting up the infrastructure or the environment that you need in order for this to succeed. So that is the incentive framework that you envision for this, or one of the building blocks, let's say. One follow-up question regarding the validation part, because you mentioned that you're using hindcast data. I just pick up an argument that 𝐨𝐤𝐤 once again brought forth recently, when he said, should we actually use hindcast data for the validation part, or is it rather unfair because you can't look into the future, you have to use forecast data to actually make the decision, and then there's a risk associated with that. So shouldn't you be also charged on that?
Well, I guess what it boils down to is trying to reduce the uncertainty. The motivation for doing a hindcast, in theory, is that the result will be more accurate. If you look at off-the-shelf weather data products, I don't believe there is a hindcast analysis product that's available soon enough off the shelf. So if you take ECMWF, you have forecasts done by IFS, which is a model, but the reanalysis data sets generally aren't released, and possibly even years into the future. Whereas we run a model directly, just like they run a model, and we can run it as a hindcast. And as soon as the input data that we need to do that are available, which only takes a matter of days, then we can generate a hindcast. But yeah, equally, we know the performance of the forecast, and we know, and we can translate that uncertainty into any claim. So we can reduce down claims relative to uncertainty. The key thing, though, is that we've got to be 100% certain that any changes we make to a flight plan, any deviations we do not create a bigger problem than we're trying to solve. And I know this has been a topic of discussion throughout this podcast, but absolutely, we're keenly focused on understanding, if we make a change to a flight plan, does that create any penalties, fuel burn, time, cost, and ensuring that any of those kind of penalties are kept at an absolute minimum, certainly relative to the benefits. So that's why we don't target all flights. We really just go for this very small subset where we're quite confident there's going to be a strong warming effect, and we can do a deviation without creating any significant fuel penalties and CO2 emissions.
And in order to predict this very well, weather prediction plays a huge role in the entire data chain. And this nicely leads on to a question that was forwarded from our previous guest. So we have this tradition that one guest passes on the question to the next. And previous guest was Nicolas Meyer from S2R, who wants to know more about your weather model and how much better your weather model is than what's publicly available.
Well, we have a manuscript in preparation, which, as I said, is almost ready to submit. But some people may have noticed I was doing quite a lot of meetings towards the end of last year, where I was starting to present some of the preliminary results from the scientific validation we've done. So our approach is to use a weather model to both forecast water vapor in the atmosphere, which then goes into a model like 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤, which predicts the climate impact of an individual flight. We can use satellite observations, obviously, to determine, in some cases, did a particular flight create contrails or not. But it does not tell you what the actual radiative impact of that entire flight was. We're using the model also to verify if the conditions were met to create those warming contrails based on where the aircraft ended up flying. So we focus on water vapor. That's the primary control on any calculations that are done subsequently, and the evolution of that water vapor through the atmosphere over time. So we have compared our forecast against in situ measurements that come from radiosonde balloons and an aircraft-based science project called 𝐥𝐢𝐤𝐤, which has been mentioned. So we gathered together for a domain where we ran the model for an entire year, well, at frequencies through an entire year. During our trials, we then gathered together all the radiosonde data, all of the available 𝐥𝐤𝐤 in situ data, and we have been able to quantify the skill of the model for predicting supersaturated conditions. So this is where relative humidity with respect to ice is above 100%. And so we can put this into statistics that have been used fairly widely now. The F1 score is one of those statistics. And this basically tells us that, well, first of all, about 18% of the time when you fly above 18,000 feet or so, 25,000 feet, you're going to find ice supersaturated conditions. So if you go anywhere above 25,000 feet, you've got an 18% chance of finding relative humidity greater than 100% relative to ice. So our model 2 times out of 3 predicts that correctly. 1 time out of 3, we get it wrong. But the most important thing is, how often do we get the predictions of below 100% relative humidity right? So when we're trying to put an aircraft into airspace that's below 100% relative humidity, we're getting it right 92% of the time. So what that tells us is, first of all, the majority of the time we don't need to do a deviation, and we know that because it's only 18% of airspace that has the conditions that lead to a deviation. So maybe 6% overall, we do a deviation based on a model that predicted a supersaturation that didn't exist, but 92% of the time we put that into dry air. When we get it right, based on trials we've just completed with 12 aircraft operators last year, supported by the European Space Agency, we're seeing somewhere between 30 and 40 tons of CO2 equivalent impact avoided. And that's across all different aircraft sizes. Obviously, the larger the aircraft, the larger the contrails, the larger the avoided impact. But what this really tells us is that even if you take into account that level of uncertainty, with fuel penalties which are pretty small and emission penalties are very small, we're always going to get, with this method, a significant benefit. It's of the order of 10 times benefit to penalty with that uncertainty. If we could do it absolutely perfectly, we'd probably be closer to 50 or 100 times benefit relative to penalties.
So everyone who loves statistics, I think will enjoy this episode for sure. But just to reiterate, there is always this argument that what if we predict that there is an ISSR and there is actually not, but then we have deviated and we have deviated into another ISSR. So worst case. Could you, just to reiterate what you just said, apply those statistics to this case? How likely is it actually?
Well, the 1 in 3 deviations that we shouldn't have done, 9 out of 10 times we put into a dry place. So 1 out of 10 times of those 1 in 3, we put it back into an ISSR. Or we put it into an ISSR where it wasn't necessarily in one. But still you can factor that into a calculation to get to your net benefit, and you're still order of magnitude benefit relative to any problems.
Right. And like I said, the weather prediction plays a huge role. And in the beginning, I said I'm very curious about AI. So obviously, I also want to learn about opportunities maybe that come along with machine learning. And what you said is essentially that an off-the-shelf weather model, so you're using the WRF, can be tweaked in such a way that it becomes really good at predicting these ISSRs. And the way you do that is that you take, I want to say in my words, a module, right? The schema, the Thomson schema, which was developed by someone who is with you, with SATAVIA, Greg Thompson. So this is a major asset, obviously, right? And I'm just wondering, are there any opportunities for machine learning to maybe in the future emulate these microphysics processes and to make it a lighter process? Because right now you've mentioned a couple of times the supercomputer, and that implies very heavy resources. So is there any potential?
Absolutely. So yeah, we have taken a model that you can take off the shelf, but we have configured it in a way that makes sense for this particular use case. So very high resolution geographic domain, many more vertical model layers than you would find in a standard sort of institutional type weather forecast, concentration of vertical levels where aircraft fly, enhanced microphysical scheme. So this is a multi-moment cloud microphysics scheme based on physics, where we calculate the formation of different hydrometeors, and the resultant water vapor in the atmosphere is what we're interested in. And that's affected by, do we form clouds or do clouds dissipate? So that microphysical scheme actually does those explicit calculations. There's probably only so much more you can do with these physics-based models without having better inputs. So you could either try and improve the inputs that drive the models. And so some companies, for example, Tomorrow.io, putting new types of satellite in space to gather some of that information that will improve the forecasts. And then, of course, yes, there's great potential, I think, to apply some AI type techniques to the output from these numerical weather prediction models to further enhance the skill of those forecasts. So I probably see either a hybrid of the two approaches or a completely different generation of models coming online in the next decade.
It's going to be exciting for sure. And I'm not sure if the development will be as quick as with the language models. The reason is very simple. You need observational data. You need a lot of observational data as the ground truth to train those models. Question I'm asking myself is, so you mentioned IAGOS as a data source, right? There are only a dozen airplanes right now flying around. So the data, you use the data for a whole year, which is then, of course, more data, but still it's not a lot. So how can it be that to train a machine learning model, some say, well, we don't have enough observational data, but then to quantify how good your weather model is, this IAGO data set then is enough. So for me, I don't know, it's a little bit of a contradiction.
So in itself, the IAGOS data set doesn't provide enough measurement data. Actually, it does give us really good distributions of the if you like, the quantity of water vapor in the atmosphere, ranging from 0 to over 100% relative humidity. So, I mean, the first test is, can the model reproduce the distribution, the shape of all of those measurements? But there's far more vertical profiles available from radiosondes, which are launched every day around the world, thousands of them, which provide one or more vertical soundings, which tell you how the water vapor changes with height in the atmosphere, and it's relative to the winds, the temperature, pressure. So that's also, we spend a lot of time working with the Radiosonde data, ensuring we've got the highest quality data, applying corrections to then do the validations. So the two together can actually provide a lot of observational constraint to allow us then to basically understand the skill of the model. I think, though, yes, adding more aircraft sensors does sound interesting. However, making that measurement is non-trivial. You need quite a complex piece of kit. It tends to need quite a lot of maintenance. And in fact, is that the best way of providing the data that's needed? Satellites in space. There's a lot of low Earth orbit satellites now going up. Actually, these platforms provide far better spatio-temporal resolution of measurement, a more systematic measurement. I would say biggest bang for the buck would be to focus on what can go on satellite platforms and fill the gaps that way. And that will be faster than trying to fit out every single aircraft in the commercial fleet, which, bear in mind, they fly fairly limited profiles through the Earth's atmosphere. The Earth's atmosphere goes up 100 kilometers. Aircraft don't go higher than 10 kilometers, and they tend to fly the same routes, and they don't cover a lot of the Earth's atmosphere. So actually, we might have biases introduced if we have a strong reliability on an in situ measurement coming from the commercial aviation fleet, whereas satellites measure every single part of the atmosphere from the top of the atmosphere down to the surface at all places, usually. Maybe not over the poles always, but you've got a far richer data set. So it's a trade-off. We need to combine measurements from different sources, different approaches, remote sensing, in situ, surface-based. We need models. It's no use just having an aircraft measurement telling you how much water vapor you're in. You need to know where to put that aircraft. So it all goes back to having a good representation of the Earth's atmosphere into the future, so you know how to navigate an aircraft, whether that's done pre-tactical at the flight planning stage or on the flight deck. We're going to need weather models, and we're going to need observational data, and we're going to need to bring those two things together over time. Much faster, in a way that delivers a far more accurate prediction going forwards. I would say where we are with numerical weather prediction today is quite impressive compared to where it was 10 or 20 years ago. I'd say it is fit for purpose today to do contrail management. It could be improved. And I think we really need to see more funding going into improving these kind of models. I feel like it has been overlooked somewhat in this issue.
My last question would be, before you have the chance to pass on the ball as well, but my last question would be, so for SATAVIA this year, 2024, where do you stand and what are your big milestones? What is coming up for you right now?
2024 is a big year for us. We have just kicked off our first production contract with Etihad. So we've started doing our regular contrail management flights, and that's within day-to-day flight operations. So we're really excited to be kicking that off. That's a multi-year contract. We're aiming to have the accreditation done. We expect to list our project in partnership with Air Carbon Exchange, which is our trading partner under the Abu Dhabi global market, maybe as soon as the middle of the year, where we could actually start looking forwards with some of these credits. So I think we're going to see our first trades this year, and we hope to have a new customer or two by the end of the year. And we welcome working with any party on solving this problem.
I keep my fingers crossed and all the best on that journey. Now, passing on the ball, our next guest will be Dan Rutherford from the ICCT. So is there any question that comes to mind?
I don't know if Dan can answer this, but so we often hear the science isn't good enough, so we shouldn't be doing contrail management. Quite a lot of that is directed at the skill of weather forecast models. So my question really would be, how good do they need to be, and how exactly are we establishing what is good? I mean, what are we looking at exactly? So if he can help to narrow down that in any way, I'd be very interested to hear his reply.
That's a very fair question. I'll take it on. Other than that, Adam, Thank you very much for taking part. This was very insightful. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
And then speak soon.
Bye for now.
Bye.